Spring came to the Rio Grande Valley in 1865 with wildflowers blooming across the coastal prairies and warm breezes blowing in from the Gulf of Mexico. It should have been a peaceful time. The war was over, everyone knew it. Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th. The Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's greatest fighting force, had laid down its arms and gone home. News traveled slowly in 1865, especially to the remote border region where Texas met Mexico. But by early May, both Union and Confederate forces along the Rio Grande knew the war was ending. There was even an informal understanding, a gentleman's agreement between the opposing commanders that they wouldn't attack each other. Why fight when the cause was already lost? Why waste lives when peace was just days or weeks away? But one Union officer didn't get the message. Or perhaps he did and simply didn't care. Colonel Theodore Barrett commanded Union forces at Brazo, Santiago, near the mouth of the Rio Grande. He was a political officer, not a professional soldier, the kind of man who had spent the war in safe, rear-area positions while others did the fighting. Now, with the war ending, Barrett apparently decided he wanted to win a battle, to claim some glory for himself before it was too late. It was a decision that would lead to the last land battle of the Civil War, a pointless fight that would accomplish nothing except to add a few more names to the long list of the dead. Facing Colonel Barrett's forces was Colonel John Salmon "Rip" Ford, and if you were going to pick one man to represent Texas in the Civil War, Ford would be a strong candidate. Rip Ford, the nickname came from his habit of writing "Rest in Peace" on casualty reports, was a Texas legend even before the Civil War started. He had been a Texas Ranger, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and an Indian fighter on the frontier. He knew the borderlands like he knew his own name, and he commanded the respect of every man who served under him. At 50 years old, Ford was old for a field commander, but he was tough as leather and sharp as a bowie knife. He had spent the war defending the Rio Grande border, keeping the Cotton Road open, and maintaining the fragile peace with Mexican authorities across the river. He was exactly the kind of experienced, competent officer the Confederacy needed, and exactly the kind of opponent Colonel Barrett should have left alone. Ford had approximately 300 men under his command near Brownsville, a mix of Confederate cavalry and some French-Mexican Imperial cavalry who were fighting alongside the Confederates. Mexico was in the middle of its own war at the time, with French forces supporting Emperor Maximilian against Mexican Republicans. Ford knew the war was over. He had no intention of starting trouble, but if trouble came looking for him, he was ready to finish it. On May 11, 1865, Colonel Barrett ordered an attack. He sent a force of about 300 Union soldiers, including infantry and cavalry from the 62nd U.S. Colored Infantry and the 2nd Texas Cavalry, a Union unit composed of Texans who had remained loyal to the United States, to march from Brazo, Santiago toward Confederate positions near Brownsville. The stated objective was to capture Confederate outposts and possibly some cattle. The real objective was probably to give Barrett something to brag about, a victory he could claim as his own. The Union force marched inland along the coastal plain, moving through scrubby brush country and small ranches. They encountered light Confederate resistance at a place called Palmito Ranch, little more than a few buildings and some livestock pens, and pushed the defenders back. Barrett's men spent the night of May 11th near Palmito Ranch, probably feeling quite pleased with themselves. They had advanced, they had scattered some Confederate pickets, and they hadn't suffered any serious casualties. Maybe this would be an easy victory after all. They had no idea what was about to hit them. When word reached Colonel Ford that Union forces were advancing on Brownsville, he reacted with the speed and decisiveness that had made him famous on the frontier. He gathered every available man, his Confederate cavalry, the French-Mexican cavalry, and even some artillery pieces, and rode to meet the Union force. Ford had no interest in glory or in extending a lost war. But he had orders to defend his position, and more importantly, he had pride. No political colonel from some safe headquarters was going to march into his territory and push around his men without a fight. On the morning of May 12th, Ford's combined force caught up with the Union troops near Palmito Ranch. What followed was more of a running fight than a traditional battle. Cavalry charges, skirmishes in the brush, artillery dueling at long range. The Union commander, realizing he was outnumbered and facing a much more aggressive opponent than he'd expected, ordered a retreat back toward Brazos Santiago. Ford's cavalry pursued, snapping at the Union rear guard, forcing them to stop and fight, then pursuing again when they retreated. For miles, Ford's Confederates chased the Union troops across the coastal prairie. Union soldiers would form defensive lines, fire volleys, then retreat when Confederate cavalry threatened to flank them. Artillery from both sides boomed, sending shells whistling overhead. Sergeant William Robinson of the 62nd U.S. Colored Infantry might have been helping his squad maintain formation during the retreat when a Confederate shell exploded nearby, showering them with dirt and fragments. "Keep moving," his officer shouted. "Stay in order. Don't let them scatter us." But the Confederate pressure was relentless. Ford's men, many of them veterans who had been fighting along the border for years, knew exactly how to harass a retreating force. They would ride hard, fire from the saddle, force the Union troops to deploy into line, then disappear into the brush before they could be engaged effectively. The Union retreat became increasingly disorganized. Men were falling out from exhaustion, the wounded had to be carried, and ammunition was running low. What had started as an offensive operation was turning into a desperate attempt to escape. By the end of the day on May 13th, the Union force had been driven all the way back to their starting point. They had suffered over 100 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, while the Confederates had suffered almost none. It was a clear Confederate victory, a successful defense of Confederate territory against a Union attack. Rip Ford had done his job perfectly. But then came the news that changed everything. Union prisoners captured during the fight told their Confederate captors something the Texans didn't know. Robert E. Lee had surrendered more than a month ago. And there was more. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The war was over. The Confederacy had lost. The Confederate soldiers stood in stunned silence as they processed this information. They had just won a battle in a war that had already ended. They had risked their lives and taken the lives of Union soldiers for a cause that no longer existed. Private Miguel Gonzalez, a Confederate cavalryman who had ridden with Ford's pursuit, might have turned to his friend and said, "We won, but what did we win? What was the point?" His friend would have no answer. There was no answer. Within days, word came down through official channels. All Confederate forces were to surrender. General Edmund Kirby Smith, commander of the Trans-Mississippi Department, which included Texas, formally surrendered on June 2, 1865. Colonel Rip Ford had the sad duty of disbanding his command and surrendering to Union authorities. The men who had fought so well at Palmito Ranch laid down their weapons, signed parole papers, and went home. The Battle of Palmito Ranch went into the history books as the last land battle of the Civil War, a Confederate victory that changed nothing, a final flash of defiance from Texas before the long nightmare finally ended. Looking back at Texas's role in the Civil War, what do we see? We see contradiction and complexity. Texas successfully defended its home territory, keeping its ports open longer than any other Confederate state, and maintaining the vital Cotton Road to Mexico. The victories at Galveston and Sabine Pass were genuine military achievements, examples of tactical brilliance and raw courage. But we also see catastrophic losses far from home. Hood's Texas Brigade, Terry's Texas Rangers, Granberry's Brigade, and countless other units bled and died in distant states for a cause that was built on the foundation of slavery, an institution that was morally wrong and that Texas had fought to preserve. We see incredible courage, men climbing back onto rocks after being shot multiple times, 47 soldiers defeating 5,000, cavalrymen charging into walls of fire with revolvers blazing. But courage in service of a flawed cause is still courage spent unwisely. We see innovation and adaptability, cotton-armored steamboats, the Cotton Road's economic lifeline, the Rangers' revolution in cavalry tactics. Texans showed remarkable creativity in solving problems and fighting against long odds. But we also see disasters born of arrogance and poor leadership. Sibley's nightmare retreat from New Mexico, the senseless slaughter at Franklin, the final pointless battle at Palmito Ranch. For the Texans who survived and came home in 1865, the world had changed. The Confederacy was gone. Slavery was abolished. Texas was under military occupation during Reconstruction. The certainties they had fought for no longer existed. A veteran of Hood's Texas Brigade, returning to his farm near Houston, might have stood in his field and looked at the land he had left 4 years earlier. He would have been older, harder, haunted by memories of cornfields running red with blood and friends who would never come home. He might have thought about the flag bearers falling one after another at Antietam, about the boulders of Devil's Den, about the long marches and the cold camps, and the moments of terror when death seemed certain. He might have wondered if it had been worth it. The answer to that question would depend on who you asked. The Confederate veterans, meeting in the years after the war, would talk about duty and honor and fighting for their homeland. They would tell stories of courage and sacrifice, and those stories were true. Men did fight bravely, did die for their beliefs. But there were others who would give a different answer. The formerly enslaved people, freed by Union victory and the 13th Amendment, would tell you the war was absolutely worth it because it ended their bondage. The Union soldiers who died to preserve the United States would tell you it was worth it to keep the nation together. And historians, looking back with the benefit of time and perspective, would tell you that while the human cost was terrible, the end of slavery was a necessary step forward for America. Texas emerged from the Civil War with a complicated legacy. The state had fought hard, lost thousands of its sons, and been on the losing side of the greatest conflict in American history. But Texans had also proven something about themselves. They were tough, they were innovative, and they wouldn't quit even when the odds were impossible. That legacy would shape Texas identity for generations. The stories of Sabine Pass, of Hood's Brigade, of Terry's Rangers would be passed down and remembered. They would become part of what it meant to be Texan. The idea that Texans don't back down, that they find a way to win against long odds, that they're willing to fight for what they believe in. But as we remember those stories today, we also have to remember the whole truth, that the cause those men fought for was the preservation of slavery, that their courage was in service of an unjust system, and that the real heroes of the Civil War era include not just the soldiers, but also the enslaved people who endured bondage, and the abolitionists who fought to end it. History is complicated. People can be brave and wrong at the same time. We can acknowledge the courage of individual soldiers while condemning the cause they fought for. We can honor the sacrifice while rejecting the ideology. That's the real lesson of Texas in the Civil War. Courage matters, but so does justice. Innovation matters, but so does fighting for the right cause. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to look back at our history honestly, to see both the moments of valor and the moral failures, and to learn from both. The cotton wagons stopped rolling to Mexico. The Cottonclads were dismantled. The guns of Fort Griffin fell silent. The survivors of Hood's brigade came home, and those who didn't remained in distant graves, far from the Texas soil they had fought to defend. The Civil War cost America approximately 620,000 lives, more than all other American wars combined up to that point. Texas contributed thousands to that terrible toll. Every small town and county in Texas had its list of the dead, its men who marched away and never returned. But out of that tragedy came change. Slavery ended, the Union survived, and Texas, though defeated and occupied, would eventually rebuild and thrive. The last shot of the Civil War was fired at Palmito Ranch on May 13, 1865. It was a Confederate victory in a lost war, a final, defiant gesture from Texas before the long, difficult work of reunion and reconstruction began. The war was over. The healing could begin. We've traveled a long road together through Texas's Civil War story, from the dusty Cotton Road to the blood-soaked cornfields of Maryland, from the Cottonclads at Galveston to the final battle at Palmito Ranch. We've met remarkable people: Dick Dowling and his 47 Irish gunners, the flag bearers who fell one after another at Antietam, William Barbie climbing back onto his rock again and again, Rip Ford defending his position even as the war was ending. These stories are important not because they glorify war. War is terrible and should be a last resort, but because they teach us about courage, sacrifice, and the complexity of history. They remind us that real people lived through these events, that they made choices, good and bad, and that their actions shaped the world we live in today. Texas's Civil War story is a story of contradictions, brilliant victories and catastrophic defeats, innovation and disaster, courage in service of an unjust cause. It's not a simple story of heroes and villains, and that's what makes it worth studying. As you think about what you've learned, remember these key points. 1. Geography matters. Texas's border with Mexico made it unique and strategically vital to the Confederacy in ways no other state could match. 2. Individuals matter. From generals to privates, from Dick Dowling to nameless teamsters on the Cotton Road, individual choices and actions shaped events. Moral complexity matters. We can acknowledge bravery while condemning the cause those brave people fought for. 4. Memory matters. How we remember history shapes how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. The Civil War ended more than 150 years ago, but its echoes still resound in American life. The debates about states' rights versus federal power, the ongoing struggle for racial equality, the question of how we honor history while acknowledging its moral failures, these all trace back, in part, to the Civil War and its aftermath. Texas played its role in that great drama, for better and worse. Now it's up to us to learn from that history, to understand it fully and honestly, and to build a better future informed by the lessons of the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Texas's Civil War history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past and learned something new, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. We work hard to bring you engaging, educational content about history that matters, and your support helps us create more stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What surprised you most about Texas's role in the Civil War? Which battle or story resonated with you the most? What other historical events or time periods would you like us to explore? Maybe you're interested in the settling of the frontier, World War II and Texas's role in it, the civil rights movement in Texas. Let us know what you'd like to learn about next. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and who we want to become. Until next time, stay curious.